G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with episode 20 in Australia's Day of National Shame, book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. This chapter is called The Royal Commission, and I thought I might as well illustrate it with a cartoon on page 87 of the 1943 first edition of Khaki and Green. The Royal Commission. When Cabinet learned what had happened at Darwin, there was unanimous support for Curtin's proposal that a Royal Commissioner be appointed immediately. His terms of reference would be wide enough to allow him to conduct a post-mortem into what had gone wrong, and he would also be able to make recommendations to prevent it happening again. The man the Attorney-General chose for the job was a judge of the Victorian Supreme Court, Mr. Justice Charles Lowe, who was one of the state's most eminent jurists. Two barristers were also retained to assist him, John Barry, a King's Counsel who later became a judge himself, and Basil Murphy as his junior. The three appointments were made on the 3rd of March, and at 1:40 the following morning they gathered at Melbourne Aerodrome for the long flight to Darwin. With them were two typists. By the time they got to Adelaide, however, Murphy had been taken ill, apparently airsick, and his place was taken by a South Australian barrister, H.G. Alderman. At Daly Waters it was decided to send the secretaries back because of the increasing frequency of air raids in Darwin. Barry's job when they got to Darwin would be to assist the judge in the actual inquiry, while Alderman would collect and sift the evidence and marshal the witnesses who were to be heard. They finally reached Darwin at 8 o'clock the following night, 18 hours after they had left Melbourne. That's bloody good for 1942. And the two barristers immediately went to work. All that they knew up till then was the various conflicting reports sent in by individuals in all three services. The whole hearing was held in camera, and every witness was given Lowe's personal assurance that confidence would be respected. Even junior officers were encouraged to speak out frankly against the incompetence of their superiors. After a short night's sleep, the proceedings opened at 11:45 the following morning and were so disorganised that there was no Bible to swear the first witness, Major General David Blake. To put slightly more distance between the town centre and the room where the inquiry was being held, it was agreed to move 3 kilometres out of town to the Hotel Parap. What the judge was not told until later was that the Hotel Parap was flanked on one side by an ammunition dump and on the other side by an aerodrome. In all, 70 witnesses were examined in Darwin and 30 more in Melbourne, requiring a formidable amount of research and homework by Barry and Alderman. Barry's fee of £894 was criticised later as being extravagant, but he worked tirelessly throughout the time that the Commission was meeting. There was no formality at the hearings, apart from the need to caution some witnesses that they were on oath. Quote, "We are prepared to hear people in the town in any guise at all," Lowe coaxed. "There is no formality here," unquote. Witnesses were not hurried, but the moment Lowe decided that they had nothing else to offer, they were hustled out to make room for the next person, and on some nights witnesses would be starting to give their evidence at midnight. There was criticism after Lowe had presented his report that he had not called all the witnesses who could have thrown light onto what had happened. In particular, he did not call Arthur Miller, the deposed chief warden, nor the government secretary who was closest to Abbott in day-to-day working. Lowe responded by saying, quote, "I did not choose the people who gave evidence. The most I did in this regard was to ask counsel assisting if such and such a person was available and could be called. Above all, speed was vital," unquote. The Commission sat with a constant threat of an imminent Japanese invasion hanging over it in their minds. Service witnesses gave hopelessly conflicting opinions as to what had happened between Lou Kernock's warning from Darwin radio and the first bombs falling, and even after hearing all the evidence, Judge Lowe said that he was still not sure what had happened. Some of the witnesses appeared not to be telling the truth, among them, surprisingly, Air Vice Marshal Richard Williams, who had seen the first raid from the town and the second from the RAAF base. Lowe wanted his opinion about the flight of the Air Force personnel into the bush, but Williams chose to deny that he even knew it had happened. Quote, "You were at the base when the order was given by the station commander, which was followed by a very rapid exodus from the station," unquote, Mr. Justice Lowe began, and was pulled up short when Williams interrupted, quote, "I never heard of it," unquote. Quote, "Have you ever heard that personnel up there took to the bush?" unquote, John Barry persisted, taking over from the judge, who tended to hand the questioning over if he sensed a skirmish over the horizon. Quote, "No," unquote, said Williams firmly. Quote, "You have never even today," said the judge disbelievingly, unquote, and again Williams replied, quote, "No." Quote, "Have you not heard up until the present time that there was what might be called a rout at the Darwin station after the raid?" unquote, quote, "No," unquote. It all seemed very improbable, but Williams was a very senior officer and he was on oath. Yet he had spent most of the time at the RAAF base with Group Captain Sherger, who testified that he had gone to great lengths to speak to as many of the officers and men who had fled as possible to try to establish why they had done so. And about 3 days after the raid, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Burnett, the Chief of Air Staff, paid an unannounced and almost secret visit to Darwin to find out what had happened. It is almost inconceivable that Burnett would not want a first-hand report from an officer of Williams's seniority. On the files of the Department of Defence Coordination, there is a private report from Williams dated the 27th of February, only 8 days after the raid, in which he wrote, quote, "Personnel must not be allowed to leave the station to disappear into the scrub or to great distances within the station itself and from where they must be specially collected," unquote. One wonders why Williams would have thought it worth lying on oath, as the circumstantial evidence so strongly suggests. As it was, the Royal Commission was denied the opinions and advice of a very experienced officer on one of the most important elements of the inquiry. Boo, hiss. Throw rotten eggs at him. A great deal of valuable information about what the Americans were doing and the degree of control they were exercising over the P-40s when they were shot down must have been available, but serving American officers refused to give evidence, presumably on instructions. Lowe had no authority to compel them, as he did with Allied servicemen, that means Australian servicemen, perhaps even British. Captain Lewis J. Connolly, the officer who as US Army Air Corps operations officer in Darwin, because in 1942 there was no United States Air Force. They had a United States Army Air Corps, and the Army Air Corps had several air forces in various places. But no, there was no USAF operations officer in Darwin, had been controlling all the Kitty Hawks that were destroyed. He could have given especially valuable information, but he refused to testify. Even allowing for the fact that the Americans also had much to hide that day on the way their pilots had behaved, there seems to be no valid reason for refusing to cooperate with a formal inquiry trying to establish the truth. Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, was refused permission to be represented by a barrister when he learned the nature of some of the evidence that was being given against him. The main reasons advanced by Mr. Justice Lowe were that such a barrister would have to see the transcript of evidence, and he had promised witnesses that would not happen and that it would slow the proceedings down. Abbott complained that the evidence before Lowe was inevitably one-sided because he had not been allowed to give his own point of view. Bracket, he did so when the hearing transferred to Melbourne, close bracket. But in fact, Abbott was given plenty of notice to appear before the hearing when it was in Darwin. Instead, he had chosen to go to Alice Springs only hours before the Royal Commission arrived in Darwin, and there he remained for the whole time of the Darwin sittings. His reply to the Commissioner's request that he should give evidence was to tell the Commissioner that he should go to Alice Springs to see him, which was completely impracticable. The inescapable conclusion was that Abbott was hiding from the Commission, a conclusion that John Barry made little attempt to conceal when he was ordered to fly down to Canberra midway through the hearing to give the Prime Minister a midnight briefing. The Commission had ample first-hand opportunities to see how Australians reacted to an attack and how vital aircraft were to the defence of the Northern Territory. On one occasion they were sitting at a morning session when they were given a report that an attack was going on at that moment on the Australian anti-submarine corvette Deloraine. Deloraine was only 80 kilometres or 50 miles from Darwin when a Japanese dive bomber began to attack her. She was able to call for help immediately, and she was only 20 minutes or less away, yet there was not a single aeroplane in Darwin that could go to her aid. Wireless operators could only listen helplessly as she repeated her cry for help over and over again. Somehow Deloraine managed to survive that time and limped back to Darwin, but she was very lucky. What made the inability to protect her even more incomprehensible was that Deloraine was fitted with the only apparatus in Darwin for sweeping the magnetic and acoustic mines used by the Japanese. It was a pretty vital bit of boat work, was the Deloraine. Mr. Justice Lowe produced his written report on the 27th of March, little more than 5 weeks after the raid. His most bitter criticism was reserved for those in the RAAF operations room who had failed to pass on the original message and were so directly responsible for many of the deaths on the harbour. He then went on to deal with Griffith and the other RAAF officers who failed in their duty and prompted the chaotic flight into the bush. Quote, "And what happened at Darwin," he warned, "might well be repeated in other parts of the Commonwealth." Unquote. The report caused a ripple throughout the Defence Department and the 3 services, and it caused a ripple in the tidy life of Charles Abbott, the administrator. But no more than ripples. It was General MacArthur's arrival that secured the defences the North needed, not the Lowe report. War Cabinet decided to take no action against Abbott, although the RAAF removed almost every officer who had been involved in the debacle. The report itself was not even tabled in Parliament until after the war in the Pacific ended in October 1945, more than 3 years later. Even then, the transcripts were not declassified and they remained secret for 35 years. One man was singled out for praise by almost everyone who encountered him on the day of the raid, and that was Group Captain Frederick Scherger. Mr. Justice Lowe remarked on his, quote, "great courage and energy," unquote, and Flight Lieutenant John Wisher said of him, quote, "the men would follow that man anywhere. The example he showed us there was simply wonderful. If it had been left to him instead of Griffith, there would have been no trouble," unquote. Pilot Officer Garnet Soliu said, quote, "there is no one on the station who would have the slightest hesitation in following him in any way," unquote. Much good it did do him. In a secret submission to the Prime Minister, Air Vice Marshal Bostock, Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, admitted that the Air Force was, quote, "gravely at fault, especially in regard to panic. There is little excuse," unquote. He added, quote, "for the administrative chaos which ensued after the raid," unquote. He then ordered a purge. In the weeks that followed, high praise proved to be no protection. Wilson and Scherger were both replaced on the grounds, as Bostock put it, quote, "that they must bear the main responsibility," unquote. Many others followed them out of Darwin until there was hardly an officer or senior NCO who had discredited himself on the 19th who still remained in the Northern Territory. But it was the dismissal of Scherger that was so unjust. Perhaps unaware of what Mr. Justice Lowe had said by way of praise of Scherger, or probably just indifferent, the Air Board stripped him of official command and held him, quote, "suspended from duties," unquote. Scherger protested bitterly and for a time seriously considered resigning his RAAF commission and enlisting as a private in the army. The hostility of the Air Board was very quickly brought to the notice of the Royal Commission, and John Barry, who had personally told the Prime Minister of Shergar's bravery, assured him that it would be only a question of time before he was entirely vindicated. Reassured by the knowledge that Mr Justice Lowe was lobbying for him, Shergar asked for an interview with the Air member for personnel, but to his distress got no satisfaction. He then declared his intention of taking the matter further, as he was entitled to do under Air Force regulations, and sought an interview with the Minister for Air, Arthur Drakenford. It was a calculated gamble because Shergar knew full well that nothing would incense his senior officers more than the knowledge that he had asked for an interview with a politician. But the ploy worked. From that moment things took a dramatic turn for the better, and almost at once he was appointed to a command of the RAAF station at Richmond, from where he went on to MacArthur's Allied Command headquarters. He became one of the most respected Australian officers in the eyes of the Americans, and he was the first RAAF officer to command both Australian and American Air Forces. American Army Air Corps forces. After the war, he was Air Officer commanding RAF Malaya during the emergency, and in 1957 returned to Australia as the RAAF Chief of Air Staff before being appointed Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee with the rank of Air Marshal, the highest rank available to a serving Australian airman and the first officer in the RAAF to hold that rank. On his retirement from the RAAF, the one man who might have averted what Paul Haslutt called, quote, this day of national shame, Air Marshal Sir Frederick Shergar, KBECBDSOAFC, became the chairman of TAA, that's Trans-Australia Airlines, which went belly up and was swallowed by Ansett, before Ansett went belly up. Thursday, the 19th of February 1942, changed the lives of many people. Few good lessons came out of it, but many dreadful mistakes were made and lives lost on account of them. It showed that Australians under stress and without proper leadership are sometimes not very brave. And it showed above all the vital need to be prepared as a country, as a unit and as individuals. If even the shadow of that lesson was learned as a result of that disastrous day in Darwin, those 243 lives might not have died entirely in vain. And the next chapter is Broome, a Familiar Story. All's on a lot to YouTube. More to come. Ciao.